What's going on, guys? Nick here, and today I wanted to share with you a couple of tying techniques that I use to help bulk up the profile of my streamer flies without adding too much weight and making them hard to cast. So when we're talking about streamer flies in fly fishing, a lot of times you might hear people reference the length of the fly to explain how big a fly is. Length is very important, but with the pattern that I'm going to be tying today, I wanted to focus more on the volume and the profile. How does this profile look in the water and when it's presented to fish? You don't necessarily need an extremely long fly to present a big meal to a predator fish. So the fly that I'll be tying today is a fly called the bullet leech. So I'm going to show you the techniques that I use to create that big profile and the materials that I am going to be using today to tie this fly. Let's get into it. So first, most important material is rabbit strip. And for the color, you can play around with this. I'm doing purple today. Purple marabou is what I use to color the belly of the fly. The hook that I have in the vise is a Firehole 860 number 6 streamer hook. And the bead that I'm using there is a Round Rocks tungsten bead that is going to be in a 3/16. Again, you can play around with the color bead that you want. I tie these up with red beads, gold beads. There's so many different color beads. You can really play around with the color design on this. Next, we're going to be using some crystal flash. This one, I like this really cool red and blue flash. And then the final and probably one of the most important materials in this fly are rubber legs. So the first material I'm going to start with is the marabou. This is basically where the bulk of the fly really begins. So this is an important step that you'll need to execute right in order for this fly to have a big bulky profile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a marabou feather like this one here that has the stem all the way through almost to the tip of this feather here. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie this feather in backwards and I'm going to palmer it in. So the way I'll do that is I'm just going to grab just the very tip of that stem and I'm going to pull the rest of the fibers back so that you're left with just the little tip there. I tie that in right at the top of the shank, right where my thread is. Now this is going to be a little tricky. You don't need to lock it in because the very tip of these stems are extremely fragile. You just need a couple of wraps, and then what I'll do is I'll pull this backwards, back over towards the hook bend, and do a couple of wraps over it there. Then I can bring my thread forward. And now I can begin palmering this feather. Don't pull it too hard in the beginning. Like I said, that stem is really frail right there at the end. And I just want to do layered wraps. I don't want them to overlap. And every rotation I'm going to pull those fibers back just to ensure none of these marabou fibers are getting tangled up. I want a nice full profile on this fly. Just keep evenly distributing these fibers around the hook shank. And you can see it's already starting to build up kind of a cone shape with the marabou feather towards the tail. That's exactly what you want. Now this is also a great technique for if you want marabou as a tail on your streamer. So like a classic woolly bugger, this is a great technique to use if you want a nice, full, fluffy, round tail. It also works really well for utilizing your materials. A lot of times when you grab a marabou feather for a woolly bugger, you might just use the tip of it. But with this technique, you really use almost every single fiber in the whole feather. The feather will basically tell you when to stop wrapping. You won't be able to wrap any further because that stem gets pretty thick towards the end. So even if you wrapped up close to your bead here, that's totally okay. You just want to lock it in and you'll wrap back over your wraps here so that you can lock this in and you're not losing fibers. Just trim that off. Just wrap back over your marabou. And you want to go back to right about the hook point, maybe a little bit further back. I'll just trim this up because I like to have a nice clean finish. You don't want your hook shank right behind the bead too clogged up. It'll make finishing your fly a little harder. These feathers look pretty good, but I'll just use the bodkin to make sure there are no fibers that are tangled up, so that you really optimize the fullness that you're trying to create out of this technique. Next thing I'll do is these fibers are a little bit long for my preference. What I like to do is I'll get my fingernail at the end of these fibers and just pinch and pull. I'll comb these back and just pinch with my fingernail to pull out the longer fibers and just shorten this up a little bit. The rabbit strip is what's going to be the length of this fly. You could also just trim it, but in my opinion that's a little bit harder to get the right shape that you're wanting out of it. If you just pull it out, it'll maintain its shape, but it'll just shorten up a little bit. Alright, that looks better. You can always do that when the fly is finished too. Now, for the rabbit strip, if you buy these half skin packs, they come with a lot of different variety in the sizes, and I want to find a nice medium-sized rabbit strip. Nothing too thin and nothing too bulky. So with this, you want the hair to be just a little bit longer than your marabou tips. Just slightly. What I try to go for is the hide matches up to the same length as the tips of the marabou. So if you comb this marabou back, it should line up with the hide, and then the hair on the rabbit strip should go just further than the tips. You want this to stay on top, so I do light wraps, do 3 or 4 light wraps, and then I'll pull that down. Keep it in place. You don't want to catch too much of this hide because this will clog up your hook shank. So you want to trim it about right there, should be good. Clean that up as much as you can. And then you can lock that in. Now we'll come back to the hide and the marabou, and we're going to put in a couple strands of crystal flash. I like to make it subtle. You can add extra if you'd like, but I just like to do about 2 or 3 strands on each side of the fly. So since these are long enough, what I'll do is I'll just grab 3, put them on one side, since I want there to be a nice lateral line flash right between the marabou and the strip. And I want it to be slightly shorter than the strip as well. Again, light wraps, keep that right where you want it. lock it down. And I'll just look from the side. Before you cinch it, you can kind of adjust exactly where you want that flash to go. Trim that off and then put these strands on the other side, match them up to the same length, do the same thing. Perfect. We'll secure those in. And we'll wrap back again. So now you can see the profile of this fly is already building up. It's important, this marabou feather is important. So what I like to use light materials like marabou, rabbit hair, pine squirrel, schlappen. All of these are very light and airy, and they have a lot of volume to them. So next, what we're going to do is, since this shape is already in place, I'm going to take a rabbit strip that has long enough hair. What I like to do is I'll wrap it around my finger like this to see how long that hair is. And that looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to take that section and we're going to palmer this around the hook shank to add some extra fluff. So the way I see it is this when you can use rabbit hair to kind of act as filler. Trim that off, lock that in, we'll come up. Before I start wrapping this rabbit strip, I like to apply some of this clear Gorilla Glue to the hook shank so that it'll help seal the hide and help this fly retain much less water. So just do a little dot, nothing crazy. Spread it around a little bit. But that'll be plenty so that when I wrap this rabbit strip, it'll make the fly more durable and absorb a lot less water. So every rotation when you're a palmering rabbit strip, you want to pull it really tight. Pull it down, pull it tight. And we're going to go about 3 times around. Should be plenty. Yeah, you can see that's already adding the volume that I want to this. Now we'll lock this in. Give that strip one last tug before I trim it off. Now we want to wrap back over these fibers so that they keep their shape. Again, take your bodkin through. Make sure there's no tangles. Next thing, we're going to add some rubber legs. And the reason I said earlier why this is a pretty important element in this fly is because I think it's important to add texture to your streamers. Fish might hold on longer to your fly when they do decide to attack it or grab it if it has some texture in it. And rubber legs are a great way to add that. So with these, I'm going to set the length close to the same as the crystal flash, maybe slightly shorter. Kind of your preference on how long you want the legs to be. So I grab 3 strands, basically cut it in half and match them up on both sides of the streamer here. It's always better to make things too long because you can always trim it later on. Then we'll wrap back and you'll see that kind of flares out those rubber legs a little bit, just like that. So that they spread out around the fly. So the final material I forgot to mention earlier, we're going to finish this off with some schlappen feathers. Actually, just one schlappen feather. So I like to find a nice wide feather that's going to blend really well with the rabbit and cover up and just give this fly a nice finish. Something like that right there. It's a nice wide feather. You've got some of the down fibers in this that'll blend in really nice, and then finish off with some of the wide stiff fibers in the feather. Tie that in right in front of the rubber legs and trim off all the excess. And by this point, you should have left enough room right behind the bead to be able to give yourself a couple of rotations with the schlappen feather. And this is what creates the bullet shape or the bullet finish on this fly. Keep your rubber legs out of the way. Wrap it around. Now with the schlappen, you don't want to pull too tight, because a lot of times I'll break the stem off if I'm rotating this around, and pull too hard, it'll break off. So it's not like the rabbit strip. And basically you're just going to keep wrapping until you're satisfied with how the profile looks on it. I like to get the nice bullet shape, so I like to have nice broad shoulders on this fly, so that it pushes water and it's got a nice wide profile. Just trim off the tag end. And you've got yourself a bulky looking streamer. I don't want to wrap back too much over my hackle wraps, because then it'll slick back too much. So I want it to stay tight behind the bead so it flares up those fibers and creates that bulky profile. So right about there is good. I'll finish that off. And she's ready to fish. And I'll do one last comb through with the bodkin, just to fluff up and blend the rabbit hair with the schlappen and finish it off. Yeah, see, I'm getting the little tangles out right there on the bottom. Otherwise, it looks good. Now, I always use white thread. And that is because it is easy enough to take some alcohol markers at the end and just match up the color to your fly. Sometimes you can give it a little hot spot right there. Just color it up red or orange or whatever bright color you want. But with this guy, just a black leech. So I'm going to keep it all black. And of course, if you are a perfectionist, finish off your thread wraps with some UV or your preference of finishing glue, and you have yourself a bulky bullet leech right there. So those are a couple techniques. If you combine the marabou technique with palmering rabbit strip and finishing it off with schlappen or saddle hackle, you can see that really, the saddle hackle flares out, and then the rabbit hair really fills it nicely behind those flared out fibers. So you get a really nice full profile, but at the same time, this fly will not absorb a lot of water and it will be super easy to cast. So you could tie this up in a bigger pattern, But this fly right here has done me well for a lot of different species. It's a big enough profile that I've caught some really nice fish on this. As always, thank you guys for coming in and watching. I appreciate it. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. I'm always happy to help and answer questions. And thank you guys for tuning in. We'll catch you in the next one.